we're going to have some fun next year.
Guys, the UFC 2023 schedule is wrapping up and we pretty much know everywhere where the UFC is going to go. Besides December, we pretty much know everything about the calendar schedule for the rest of the year. We know December we're going to have UFC 296 in Las Vegas. We'll either have Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler at that event, or we'll have a lineup of a couple title fights. I would guess whichever one we don't get, we get in January. There's a good chance that we get a trip to Shanghai, maybe on December 9th. May get over to Minneapolis, Minnesota on December 2nd. But for me, I'm already wanting to know where's the UFC going to head in 2024, and if we're actually going to get the intense travel schedule that we had back in 2019, or if we're still gonna live like we're in the pandemic and have every fourth show at the UFC Apex. At a recent post-fight press conference after a Dana White's Contender Series show, Dana White alluded to the fact that he had mapped out the UFC schedule up until March of 24, including some big fights.
The last 2 days, yesterday and today, we have put together fights all the way up into March of next year.
And alluded to a couple locations, which I'll get to in a bit. Now, I've put together everything I know about the UFC's 2024 schedule, including all the cities that they go to every year, all the tourism deals that they have to obligate them to visit certain cities, all the places that have been mentioned that have strong possibilities, as well as a couple pretty strong guesses that I feel like we could expect. Now, keep in mind, all of these are just guesses for me, predictions, nothing official here or no news to be broken, but let's jump in. Now, the first thing that we can pen down is that the UFC will visit Las Vegas several times in 2024. As far as I know, they still have a deal with the T-Mobile Arena to hold 4 shows there. We'll probably have some Apex shows as well, but I'll get to that. Usually the UFC the last couple years has gone to Las Vegas in March, in July, September, and in December to the T-Mobile Arena. Now, the interesting thing about next year that could shuffle things up a little bit is UFC 300. If the typical pay-per-view ordering falls in place, that would place it in April, which is a pretty awkward time to have it, considering April's not usually one of the biggest pay-per-view months of the year. Usually that falls on March or September or July or December. So it'll be interesting to see how the UFC handles that, if they'll just switch March and April and have UFC 300 actually in April, or they could even double up on pay-per-views earlier in the year, perhaps in February, so that the timing of UFC 300 falls into March. But for now, we can be sure 4 shows of the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas. Now, the next show that we can guarantee we're probably like 99% going to have is an Abu Dhabi show, a pay-per-view in October. They've been doing that every year for the last couple years. They've got a deal with Abu Dhabi, so we can be sure that we're gonna have another show in Abu Dhabi in October. And then there's New York City. Every year, pretty much since 2016, we've had a November pay-per-view in New York City at Madison Square Garden. I don't know if that's ever going to change, but let's just count on that again, going to New York in November. So that's what we can most confidently say that the UFC will visit. Again, don't know how UFC 300 is going to shuffle things up a little bit. Who knows, maybe they could even have International Fight Week in March instead of July this year. That would really change a lot of things up. Let's get into the strongest rumors. The first is going to Toronto, Canada in the first quarter of 2024. Now, both Cole Shelton and Aaron Bronsteter have reported that it's likely that we see the first pay-per-view of the year in January land in Toronto. So I'm going to go ahead and pencil that in. All right, next up is Miami. The UFC made a massive return to Miami this year, and in that same press conference I alluded to from Contender Series, Dana said that there would be something big for Miami next year. So I'm guessing that's probably going to be a pay-per-view rather than a fight night. I think we'd probably get a pay-per-view in Miami. Let's just say in April, seeing as though the UFC has gone to Florida pretty often in April the last couple years. All right, next up is Southern California.
And go to a place I've been talking a lot of shit about maybe twice next year.
LA, one of those possible locations that you guys might be returning to?
In LA?
Yeah.
Southern California.
Yeah.
I would say we'll probably get one in the LA area. either Staples Center, Honda Center, the Forum. Maybe get another one there, but could also get one in San Diego again. Maybe August for a LA area pay-per-view, and who knows where the other one will fall. All right, now to several cities that, while no one has gone on public record to say there is an event in the works for next year, these are cities that either I've heard that the UFC has wanted to visit for a while, or just really, really strong guesses based on where things are headed. Now, for China, I would say we'll probably get 1 or 2 events next year. We'll see what happens with this upcoming Shanghai event. I've heard it could fall on December 9th of this year. I've also heard that it could be pushed back to early next year. So we'll probably get 1 event in Shanghai next year either way. We could also get another event in Beijing. That's probably the other city that they would visit in China past Shanghai, just since it's a big city and they haven't been there since 2018. So I'm gonna say maybe Beijing summer, spring, and then Shanghai at the end of the year. All right, now to a new one, Almaty, Kazakhstan. I had heard several times over this year that the UFC had wanted to go to Kazakhstan. After all, the cards are perfectly aligned for them to have some big stars on the card with Shavkat Rakhmonov, lots of up-and-coming Kazakh prospects. And if you remember, the UFC was supposed to go to Almaty back in June of 2020 with a card headlined by Petr Yan and Marlon Moraes. We all know what happened to that event, but they haven't even been to Kazakhstan since then, and Kazakhstan has been holding plenty of successful shows. The planned show for the UFC was at the Almaty Arena, so I would think we'll probably get an event in Kazakhstan next year. All right, here's another big one that I really hope happens, and I'm feeling more and more confident about this with every passing day, and that is Jakarta, Indonesia. I never thought that we would have a UFC event in Indonesia in 2024, but after I saw the video last week of head of UFC Asia Kevin Chong touring the Indonesia arena in Jakarta, I started to think, yeah, this might be the right time for an Indonesian event. Now, the UFC has had a deal with the Singapore Board of Tourism that they signed back in 2018 to hold 3 shows in Singapore, 1 every year, for at least 3 years. And that was actually up in 2021. And then they came back with another pay-per-view in 2022. So I would think their obligation to hold events in Singapore is contractually over. We could honestly see them shift their hub in Southeast Asia from Singapore to Jakarta. Now, why would they do that? Because they've never been to Jakarta before. The Indonesia arena is much, much bigger by about 6,000 seats, bigger than the Singapore indoor stadium. If you think about it, there's much more of a future of hosting local fighters on a card in Indonesia than there are, say, in Singapore. In the future, the UFC could host cards in Jakarta full of fighters from Indonesia, where that's a little bit less likely in Singapore. I could honestly see them having an event, even a big pay-per-view event, similar to what they did with Singapore in June. Let's say they have a Jakarta pay-per-view event this upcoming June. That would be nuts. All right, so this one I also feel pretty confident about is going back to Mexico City.
I was talking about Mexico yesterday too, which is a bit, obviously Mexico is a big, I have big plans for Mexico over the next couple of years. And we're opening the PI in Mexico.
The Spanish-speaking MMA fans may be among some of the most starved in the whole world, considering how many Spanish-speaking fighters there are on the UFC roster, but how few events we actually get in those countries. Add to the fact that the UFC is currently building the PI in Mexico City, and further add to the fact that they crowned 3 new champions from Mexico this year, I feel like we're going to get a lot more events in Spanish-speaking countries in the near future. This year they definitely dropped the ball with that, had no events on any Spanish-speaking countries, but I think they'll rectify that next year. Maybe just 1 event. I'm not sure if they'll venture outside of Mexico to any other countries in South America, but we'll see. I feel pretty confidently about Mexico City. Now, one really interesting one for next year could be Brazil. The UFC made their long-awaited return to Brazil this last January for a pay-per-view, and it didn't exactly come off as planned. The arena in Rio de Janeiro didn't even sell out, and this isn't necessarily a time when the UFC has a lot of big-ticket names from Brazil. So I expect that we still see at least 2 cards from Brazil next year, but they might be fight night shows. If I had my guess, they'll probably go back to Rio de Janeiro at some point, potentially even to Brasilia, which is where they had that March of 2020 show where they had to cancel the audience but continue the card. But they've got new broadcasting plans to air their events through UFC Fight Pass, so I know that they want to continue to have a live presence in Brazil. It's just a matter of what kind of cards are those and how often are they going to have local events. Now to Australia and New Zealand. Now, I can't remember where I heard it, but I do remember someone at a press conference saying that the UFC is wanting to visit the Anzac region twice next year. The only current deal that the UFC has in place with any of those cities is that they recently signed a deal with the Sydney Board of Tourism to host 3 pay-per-views from this year up until 2025, I believe. 3 pay-per-views over 5 years. So with that in mind, I would think that maybe we don't get a pay-per-view in Sydney next year. We get them every other year. So just to guess, I would say we get UFC events in Melbourne and in Auckland. From that same source, I can't remember who it was, but I remember them saying that the UFC really wanted to make it back to Auckland. And it's been a long time since they were in New Zealand. They have more fighters, more stars than they ever have before from that region. And they can pretty much fill every single card with a fighter from one of those 2 countries in every single fight from now on. All right, now on to Europe. This one's a little bit harder for me to feel incredibly confident about, but in a recent press conference with UFC exec Dave Shaw, he talked about a couple of the different cities that the UFC wanted to go to next year.
Are you looking at any more locations in a UK and Ireland sense that over the next year or so to go to?
Yes, we are. I mean, we talked about Dublin last time. It's been a while since we've been into Glasgow, and I know that Paul was trying to curry a little favor for that opportunity. I've been in Manchester in a long time. So yeah, we are absolutely looking at different destinations throughout the UK.
For that Dublin show, I'm just still so shocked the UFC has not made it back there since 2015. And now it feels like it's almost the right time for them to head back to Dublin with Ian Machado Gary coming up the welterweight ranks. I believe Dana White said recently that he felt like Machado Gary needed one more fight before they would put him in a headlining show in Dublin, but I think probably at the beginning of next year he'll take that fight, and then we'll get to see him fight in Dublin maybe in the summer or in the fall of next year. So I really do feel like we'll get another London show next year, maybe in the summer, and then maybe a Dublin show. As far as Paris goes, we had the event last weekend in Paris where at the press conference Dave Shaw said that going back to Paris would be a little bit tricky next year with the Olympics, so the timeline might be a little bit different. Might be a possibility of them going to a different city in France, but I think they want to make that an annual stop in France. And then another city in the US that I have heard a lot of things about this year that we never got an event for was Seattle, Washington in the US. It's been a long time since the UFC went to the Pacific Northwest in the US, and I read in an article in the Salt Lake Tribune just before their Salt Lake City show this summer that Seattle was in the running to host a pay-per-view this summer, and it ultimately went to Salt Lake City. Seattle was in the running several times throughout this year to host a UFC event, so I do think that next year we'll see a UFC event go down in Seattle. Whether it's a pay-per-view or just a fight night card, yet to be seen. And then now to a lot of cities that we may or may not see next year, but putting them on this list just because either the UFC hasn't visited them in a long time or they actually had plans to visit them in the pandemic. So some of those cities include Brooklyn, Denver, Chicago, and when you go international, Poland and Sweden. And then if you look back to when the pandemic started, there's a couple cities that had UFC shows planned, but they never actually got to go there. Places like Oklahoma City, Lincoln, Nebraska, and Portland, Oregon. Fingers crossed. The UFC has not been back to those cities since they had shows planned for spring of 2020. Now let's look at the UFC Apex shows next year. I know it's a big complaint of everyone how many UFC Apex shows we've gotten in the last couple years, but I do have good news for you. Those have been decreasing year over year by quite a bit, and I think we'll see that continue next year. I also feel like UFC Apex shows are permanently in our future and a part of the UFC product, which in some regards I don't mind too much if we get maybe 4 of those a year, maybe once a quarter. But let's quickly look at the numbers of Apex shows from the last couple years so we can expect how many we might see next year. In 2021, we had 31 UFC Apex shows. Man, props to all of us for getting through all of those. In 2022, we had 21 shows, so 10 shows less. Still a lot more for my taste. This year in 2023, we had 16 UFC Apex shows. About once a month, some months we had 2. So going from 31 to 21 to 16, maybe next year we will have 10, maybe 8. May not be such a bad thing to have a few sprinkled in there, but I do think for the most part we'll be traveling most weeks for the UFC schedule. All right, so here is a final tally of all the cities and potential schedule that we could see the UFC visit next year. Are there any cities that I didn't mention that you would love to see the UFC go next year? Anything that I totally forgot, anything that popped up in the news that I missed? Go ahead and leave a comment below. Subscribe to the channel, like this video if you enjoyed it, and let's buckle up for a new year of fights where hopefully we will be on the road a lot more, and maybe a lot of us, even me, will get to attend a UFC show in person.
We're going to have some fun next year.